All right, hello and welcome. My name's Dave Haynes, and we're here for another episode of Viewpoints. Viewpoints is the virtual podcast where we talk about all things XR, spatial computing, and the metaverse. I'm pleased to welcome some great guests here around the campfire. We have some virtual marshmallows to toast later, but first let's introduce the guests. Jamie, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, I am founder and CEO of Outlier Ventures. We are an accelerator dedicated to an open metaverse.
Great, and Ryan?
I am Ryan Gill, founder and CEO of Crucible, also the chairman of the Open Meta Association. We went through Jamie's accelerator in January of 2020, and we are a company that is building blueprints for the open metaverse.
Awesome. Petri?
Hey guys, Petri here from Helsinki, Finland. I've been investing in XR companies for the past couple of years. Super excited about the conversation today, so why don't we just dive right in. Dave, why don't you take us away?
Yeah, cool, awesome. So maybe just to set the scene and understand a bit more about what Outlier and Crucible do. Jamie, I think you call Outlier is the accelerator for Web3 or the Web3 accelerator. Maybe you can tell us, what does Web3 mean and how does that relate to the metaverse?
Yeah, so actually we're kind of now referring to ourselves as accelerator for the open metaverse, but Web3 is integral to that. So I'm imagining that most people listening will have some understanding of what we mean when we say the metaverse. Probably rooted in science fiction rather than necessarily anything that they're experiencing today. And we believe that by leveraging Web3 technologies, it allows for a more open metaverse, and open across a number of dimensions, but for us, most importantly, an open economic system. So when we say Web3 technologies, what we're referring to are decades worth of innovations, starting with Bitcoin, going all the way through to various other blockchain-based protocols like Ethereum, whereby you allow for the forms of sovereign wealth, so digital wealth that is controlled by an individual and that can't be confiscated or removed. They're in full control of that wealth on a blockchain, but also other forms of assets. And so wealth is often thought of in the context of a currency or money. But of course, as we'll know in things like gaming, there are other forms of wealth. It could be a wearable, it could be an in-game item. And so we believe that blockchains as an open economic system allow for transferability of wealth from across platforms, from across games, within games. And this creates a more open economic system. That doesn't mean that there can't be platforms in it. It doesn't mean that there can't be forms of centralization. You know, some platforms will be more centralized than others if they're pushing the boundary in terms of, say, the technology and the user experience. But we believe long-term, a more open system will win out. And as forms of digital value that are currently locked in platforms become unlocked through these open economic systems, there's kind of this Cambrian explosion of innovation. And things like DeFi, so there's kind of a subset of the blockchain space called DeFi, primarily based on Ethereum at the moment, but expanding to other protocols, which is decentralized finance. And so this is when you can take a digital asset and then you can begin to do some basic things with it, like borrow and lend. You can use it as collateral. And so we believe that this is going to be really important to the metaverse generally, and why we advocate for an open metaverse. Because if you think about all the digital wealth that is currently locked in platforms, the people whose wealth that is are effectively financially excluded. So they can't use that wealth value that they've earned through time and money on these platforms, in these virtual worlds, in these gaming environments. They can't transfer it out. They can't exchange it for other forms of value, and they certainly can't go to a bank and get a loan for a mortgage. And so, we believe, given there's billions of dollars of value being created in the metaverse, it's really important that that value can become unlocked and used in both the physical and a digital sense.
Thanks. That was very comprehensive in itself already. Ryan, going to you. Crucible's tagline is blueprints for the open metaverse. So tell us a little bit about your point of view for building the open metaverse.
Yeah, absolutely. The stage that we're at with everything, I like to consider that as we move into Web3, that is Metaverse 1. It is the first iteration that we're seeing take shape of really this thing that has been in theory and in science fiction. The beachhead for that is gaming. I think it's pretty clear to everybody who pays attention that NFTs as art today will eventually evolve into more interactive art through environments and games and things like that. So, the experience in LA and working in innovation is kind of what shaped up my personal, thesis for the future, which is what I referred to as the open metaverse when we started the company. And now I'm in a position to actually be talking with all of the major gaming companies and tech companies on sort of a weekly basis. And really, the key is that the only way to Web3 is decentralization. And I think everybody knows this and agrees with it, but doesn't have a strong strategy for it yet. And so our company exists to kind of specifically focus on the gaming industry, because we've recognized that the Web3 and the blockchain and crypto communities, they do a lot of things very well. They're very sort of like experimental, and they really push boundaries. But as a whole, that community does not understand game developers. There's some big projects of which we have in our ecosystem, and we're partnered with like Engine and certainly Polygon and there's a lot of, I think, great experimental things happening with gaming, but for the most part, the actual daily life of a game developer is something that the crypto world doesn't really understand so much. So as a company, what we've done is kind of design, simplifying the design of how Web3 interfaces are put together, and do it based off of the daily sort of problems that game developers and gamers have, so that this can be relevant for the AAA world.
Yeah,
what
got
I would
it.
say,
So,
Dave, to just build on it, because I realized I didn't say it perhaps as clearly as I would have liked to in the intro, to kind of maybe better define Web3, it's in contrast to Web2, which is kind of currently where most businesses operate, most platforms operate. And so Web2 is dominated by a handful of centralized platforms, whether that's Facebook through to Amazon, through to Google. And effectively, those platforms are owned and controlled by single corporations who value shareholder supremacy over user, generally speaking. And so Web3 is really about inverting that and focusing on the user. So having user centricity, where they have sovereignty of wealth, of data, they have control, they permission what a platform, how they want to interact with a platform, and all of their value is interoperable or transferable from a platform. So that's kind of the distinction. And we're not at Web3 yet, but what we've done is over the last decade, build a load of infrastructure that increasingly means applications can become more user-centric versus platform-centric.
yeah, and I'm going to zoom back just a little bit further, because I think we always make the assumption when we talk about metaverse that everybody's on the same page, but there's lots of different definitions out there. And I've heard some people talk about Facebook and Clubhouse as a metaverse, but then you go all the way through to the Ready Player One definition, which is in the movies that Steven Spielberg has translated from a book. And then in between you have things like Roblox, which I think everybody can relate to, or things like Fortnite, and then also virtual worlds like this. So Jamie, what, like, from your position, how do you define the metaverse, or does it really matter? Does it just need to be a kind of concept in general?
I think it does matter, because it seems to be the term that's increasingly being used. And as you say, I wouldn't say people are misusing it because it hasn't been as well defined as perhaps it could be. And it is very much rooted in science fiction. And so I do believe we need to have a more up-to-date version. And that's important because, you know, we are experiencing the metaverse now. It is not a far-off future thing. And the reason why it's important for people to realize that is because, you know, it's easy to just go with the flow, accept the way the world is, the status quo, and see an extension of the existing Web 2 platform monopoly model. Unless we start thinking through design principles and we start asking questions, fundamental questions about what we want the metaverse to be. So on the one hand, we're in it, it's happening. On the other hand, we can impact what the metaverse is. So what the metaverse is not yet set in stone, it's fluid. Now, what I would say in terms of my definition of the metaverse is that the metaverse is singular, but there are verses within it. So I would refer to Roblox as a verse, or you know, what we're in now as a verse within the metaverse. And as you said, there is this kind of spectrum. I see it quite in simple terms. You've got, you know, hi-fi or high tech to low tech. So you've got something like, you know, Oculus, which is or anything that's happening with HTC, where you're kind of pushing the boundaries of the hardware, and people also pushing the boundaries of the software, which means not everybody can participate in that. It's quite an elite group of people on the planet right now that can participate in that system, all the way down to something like crypto voxels, which is highly voxelated environment that you can use on any smartphone that's built on top of Ethereum. And that's deliberately lo-fi, but open, so anybody can participate in that economy. So there are different kinds, different instances of the metaverse designed on different dimensions. And again, that's okay. How I would describe the singular metaverse, for me, it's really the intersection of the virtual and real or physical world, and it's that interface layer. So that's both software and hardware. Ultimately, for me, the metaverse can't be something that's just entirely virtual. It has to be something that is in our daily lives. And so whether that's, you know, AR, combinations of AR, VR, whatever it may be, the important point is, and this is why I think it's important to think about it in economic terms, is that the time and money spent in the virtual world should translate into the physical world, and vice versa. You know, so you could have a digital twin of a physical thing, a physical location, a physical object. We could exchange and barter that thing in this virtual setting, but that would then we would have to be able to exchange the physical item in the real world. So we're obviously some way off from realizing that in its truest form, but directionally for me, that is how I would define the metaverse.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm going to let Petri jump in with a question, but just before that, to make sure I understand and kind of translate with a real world example. So if my son, you know, he spends a lot of time in Roblox, or he spends a lot of time in Rec Room, those are currently kind of closed and like centralized, like virtual worlds. So if he's spending time, he's, you know, building kudos, he's got his friends network, he's got items that he may have spent my money on, you know, collecting Robux and exchanging that for goods. I guess, Ryan, what you're building is a way, if I was to build the next Roblox or the next Rec Room, I could build with your Emergence SDK and allow the users of that metaverse to be able to port those things, you know, between different spaces that I might inhabit. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a feature of it. You know, I think we're at the primitive level of all of this stuff. So the most important thing right now that we can all be talking about is decentralized identity. Right? And going back to my comment before, where like the only way to Web3 and to all of this potential is decentralization. So the gaming industry is currently in a federated state. Fortnite and other games have proved out cross-platform beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the current state of sort of all gaming backend identities. And what we're doing is integrating with that and designing a way for that transition to take place to a decentralized identity. And so we go to the sort of self-sovereign identity standard that's adopted globally in many different industries. It's not really taken much hold or had any impact in the gaming industry, but it's perfectly designed for it. You have things like decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. And what we've done is kind of rename those as your one ID as a did, and then every VC is a different persona, right? So you might play out many different personas in your life online or in games, many different avatars that belong specifically to some storyline or some world, or third-party avatars like Ready Player Me and genies and things that exist on the internet. All of these can be different credentials that can be reflected, and all of these personas can have wallets. And when these personas can have wallets, now it's up to each game developer and publisher to decide to integrate these things. But this is what completely amplifies the move towards play to earn, towards introducing NFTs as a new form of game economies and game goods, like you said, Robux and V-Bucks as multi-billion-dollar industry every year. That's what we're really focused on. So for us, this has always been a big 10-year arc, and I think hype cycles get people very excited, and I think there's incentive to move quickly in certain hype cycles, but we're taking a very measured approach to this, and the conversations I have with all of these companies is really at the sort of foundational primitive layer of how do we go from federated to decentralized.
Do you have some early examples that you can where you can illustrate the use of what you're building here and self-sovereign identity and the different modules that you have?
Yeah, I mean, we're still, very early stages. The 10-year sort of arc that I looked at was always sort of 2020 to 2030. I believe that's sort of like the arc of this open metaverse. It will live beyond that, but past that, I think we're into a different reality. And so, we're in 2021. It started out with a bang, with a global pandemic that threw us all online completely. We lived online. This is something a lot of communities did, but the world didn't do. And I think, now it's undeniable how important and influential gaming is to our future. So don't have any examples of what we're doing. I can announce that, we've partnered in the lab, the innovation lab of Ubisoft, which is, one of the biggest game companies in the world. Arguably, in my opinion, has some of the best IP, right, for story-driven games. And are really taking it very seriously to move to a free-to-play, open world, kind of open economy type gaming company. They're really driven by innovation a lot more than they have been in the past, and it's very exciting. So they have Ubisoft Connect, that's their system. We talked to Epic about Epic Online Services, that's their system. Amazon has theirs. Microsoft has theirs, Valve has Steam. So there's a handful of these systems that make up most of the industry, most of the market. And I can say for sure that at least 40-50% of them are excited about this direction and are interested to learn this, because again, I come back to everyone knows that this is the future, just not everybody has a strategy for it yet.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it makes a lot of sense. And I think with what you've been doing, community building and also a lot of evangelizing, I think it will accelerate some of these big companies to evaluate what they're doing in this space. Jamie, I'm going to come back to you and just ask, I mean, you guys were, very early investors into Crucible, while they're still building this out. What attracted you to the vision, and maybe you can speak to some of the other companies in Outlier. Well, actually, maybe first just tell us how Outlier invests, because I think some of people in the audience, especially some founders, might be interested in that.
Yeah, sure. So Outlier, so sort of the high level. So Outlier's been around for just under 8 years. We were the first institutional investor dedicated to blockchain in Europe. one of the first in the world. You could argue perhaps we're even too early. There weren't very many startups, proper startups to invest in because there was a lot of infrastructure that needed to be built. So in our earlier years, we were much more involved in helping out on realizing that underlying infrastructure. And we were a bit more like an incubator, multi-year engagement on bringing some very complex technology to market, including things like Fetch.ai and several others. We're now, fast forward, we're now at a stage where this Web3 stack is much more mature, not just, our portfolio, but the kind of wider ecosystem. We're starting to see alternatives to Ethereum emerge to allow for different use cases. And of course, ETH2 is around the corner. So we've now seen a much more mature Web3 technology stack where we can begin to look at how it's going to be applied to different verticals, different use cases at scale in a way that's affordable and doesn't add additional friction to adoption. Because ultimately, even if you care deeply about decentralization or sovereign wealth and identity, at the end of the day, if the technology is a point of friction, you can't acquire users, you're a dead startup, you can't acquire financing. So founders need to be pragmatic. So what we've done is, as the industry's evolved, as this stack's evolved, we've kind of moved up the stack. We've moved from infrastructure. A few years back, it was much more focused on middleware, so making this infrastructure usable by the majority of developers. Still, just basic developer adoption and awareness of blockchain is very low. So, it's probably less than 10% of the global developer population is remotely aware, interested, let alone using the Web3 technology stack. And therefore, as a consequence, they're not adopting the business models, the emergent business models that come with it. So we focus a lot more on middleware. But as that stack's maturing, we're now moving up the stack to the kind of application layer. So we do still invest in what we believe are primitives in the Web3 stack, and we saw Crucible as one of those, because at the end of the day, you can't have a decentralized web if you don't first have a decentralized form of identity. Sovereignty and self-sovereignty starts with identity, because at the end of the day, if I have to trust a third party with my identity or to be the broker of my identity in order to access, transfer, exchange value on the web, then I can be deplatformed. I'm going to be taxed ultimately, and I'm subject to their terms and conditions and whether they want to change them or not. So identity for us, whilst there's been huge amounts of progress in decentralization of networks like, say, Bitcoin or Ethereum at an infrastructure layer, the reality is at the application layer, things are pretty centralized, because the decentralized identity problem hasn't been solved. Because you solve identity in a decentralized way, you then can solve associated data, metadata, the rest falls into place. So that's why Crucible were a really important thing for us. Ultimately, though, we invest in founders. We invest very early stage. The function of an accelerator is to be able to take an early stage project to help it develop its business model, its proposition, to establish product market fit, to establish that the market wants the product, it will pay for the product. Then ultimately, it's to help them finance that business to scale aggressively, and acquire market share and execute on a go-to-market strategy. So on the one hand, as an accelerator, we're like any other accelerator. There are those kind of basics that you would do. But we're different because we're native to Web3. And so our starting point is our familiarity with the technology stack. Like, we can understand at what point a project can actually execute on their vision, especially in a decentralized context. We fast track, how they can leverage this Web3 stack. But also, as a consequence of beginning to adopt decentralized technologies, there are entirely new business models that they need to think through. And some of them are increasingly being established, and some of them, are kind of a glimmer in our eyes. But, as we move away from thinking about winner-takes-all platforms where you're trying to lock users in and you're trying to extract data, and you're trying to do it to the point at which you just don't piss them off and they leave, but to the very close to the edge. And so with Web3, you can both in terms of how you might finance the project, how you might govern it, but then also how you realize value from it. You might do that through a fungible or a non-fungible token. So most people, when they think of crypto, are actually thinking of a fungible token, which is effectively like a currency, i.e. one unit of that currency is similar to the other. You don't care which Bitcoin you've got, you just care you've got a Bitcoin, just like you don't care which dollar you've got, you just care you've got a dollar. And so what a lot of projects have done is they've issued their own currency or economic kind of atomic unit of value in this little ecosystem economy that they're trying to build around an application. And they will use that to incentivize, well, firstly to raise capital, to build that thing out and realize it. The good projects anyway, will use it as a mechanism to coordinate behavior. So if you think of like leveraging game theory, you kind of reward good behavior in a network. It's a cost to behavior that you don't want to see in the network. And so we spent a lot of time thinking through how they have a token optimized business. And that becomes really important in a decentralized context because there is little central coordination. Where previously a small group of people would coordinate what happens on that platform. When you remove those central points of coordination, you need for that system to function in a decentralized way. And so you can do that by effectively hard coding game theory by rewards and penalties for behavior in the system that are effectively automated and governed by a blockchain. But now, of course, we're seeing, and especially in a metaverse context, non-fungible tokens. So these are tokens where they have to be unique, have to have unique characteristics, and their provenance is important. It's important where it's come from, who created it, maybe who owned it prior to me, and therefore its uniqueness needs to be tracked in the system. And so we're also helping a number of startups leverage NFTs, both to similarly crowdfund franchise, primarily around content. That could be digital wearables, fashion, gaming, effectively pre-purchasing in-game items, pre-purchasing digital wearables. But then also NFTs are increasingly building out forms of utility. So most people think of NFTs in the context of art, often pretty 2D art that might just sit in a crypto wallet. But increasingly, NFTs are becoming multimedia. An NFT could be this space here could be an NFT in and of itself. Each item in this space could be an NFT, each kind of layer, each fragment. But importantly, because they're tokenized, they're basically code, you can program rules or characteristics into those NFTs. And so people are now building increasing forms of utility into NFTs, and they're looking at NFTs as what might be called access tokens. So by owning this token, it can allow for forms of access to experiences, both in a virtual world, but also in a physical world. So these can become a truly metaverse kind of a key ticket passport into virtual or physical reality. So, I've gone on a bit there, but as you can see, there's just lots of complexity. On the one hand, there's technical considerations, there's business models considerations, there's go-to-market, there's game theory. You're building sometimes digital economies from scratch. So effectively at our accelerator, we've got soon to be 30 full-time people who are specialists across regulatory compliance for issuing such things in different jurisdictions, all the way through to people who can design the game theoretics behind these systems, as well as CTOs that figure out how you might select various technologies without adding friction to the user experience.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's a lot to unpack there already. You mentioned the NFTs. There's blockchain. Metaverse is becoming this kind of very buzzy word. Is it more? Do you think it's a hindrance, or is there something to kind of wave to ride on? We've seen these waves of hype between, like, there was blockchain before, VR and AR in 2016, 17, and now there's a lot of hype around these all those kind of technologies and NFTs and the metaverse. So, do you think that it can actually be a hindrance to the founders?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because especially in the world of crypto, so prior it was about cryptocurrency, then it was about DeFi and decentralized finance, and now it's about NFTs. And these are all, usually triggered by either a new innovation or a new kind of application or configuration of these technologies. And they do represent step changes in the kinds of things that we can do in these new digital economies. Now, I think because often in the world of crypto and Web3, these things are underpinned by tokens, that kind of makes these hype cycles much more aggressive, because everybody's got a direct incentive in these systems succeeding. So where previously you might just be a fan of VR and you'd be advocating for it because you're a user of it, but you don't necessarily have a stake in VR technologies or platforms. With crypto, everybody's got a fractional stake in all these different projects and protocols, and this is why it's very tribal. It's why there's a huge amount of hype, almost cult-like, followings around these technologies, and it's a feature. It often, especially if you look in the context of Bitcoin, it can become quite toxic and distracting. But to your point, I think the metaverse, for me personally, the reason why I like the metaverse is twofold. One, because with the advent of NFTs, I've been in crypto for almost a decade, and I'd say it's only really in the last year that the large majority of my friends or family who aren't in this world finally get what I do because of NFTs. Previously you're talking about cryptocurrencies, you're talking about ETH, you're talking about Bitcoin. Most people aren't interested. They're never going to go to an exchange to buy something like that. They don't spend too much time thinking about what is money. It's just something that they use. But when NFTs came along, all of a sudden, the idea of digital uniqueness, you could have something that was digital and it was scarce and unique. Therefore, it could be collected. All of a sudden, I think, has allowed people to begin to understand what is Web3. Why could that be interesting? And then I think you kind of take that one step further. For me, the metaverse is a way to contextualize why Web3 is important, because I think, Dave, you mentioned at the top, most people think of the metaverse in a very dystopic context. Ready Player One is all about a single corporation trying to control the monetary policy, global monetary policy, single currency, single economy, who can exist in that economy and who can't. They can change the rules of the game at their own whim. And so, clearly that's a very dystopic vision of the direction of travel. And by the way, I think without the open metaverse, that's exactly where it will head. And the flip side is, so now people can go, well, I know the dystopic version, and you're telling me that Web3 gives a potential for something that could be more open. And all of a sudden, I wouldn't say it's a utopic version, because there's never going to be a perfect system, but people can begin to think of an alternative, right? And I think that's why the metaverse is so important, because it's grounded in this sci-fi and dystopia.
Yeah, that's awesome. And maybe kind of changing tacks a little bit. And now we've got Ryan back. I know you had to disappear for a few minutes.
It's been a wonderful adventure to be here with you.
Yeah, indeed. We should have toasted some marshmallows while you're out. But I wanted to change tack slightly and talk about you coined a phrase, or certainly the phrase is now being used, direct to avatar economy. I'd love to kind of unpack a bit more about what direct to avatar economy actually means and how it's relevant and what role Crucible plays in that.
Yeah, so for 2 years, like we started Crucible in November of 2018, and since the very beginning of it, it was really just an exercise in like really practically thinking about the metaverse. That's where open came from. Like, if you're really gonna live in it, there's certain things that you do and don't want. No matter how much you love sci-fi, or no matter how many shares you own in a tech company, you don't want to live in the world of a giant dystopic closed metaverse. And so Crucible has been just this expression kind of over and over to really practically think about what that means. And when it came to all the brands that I was talking to and the marketers and the CMOs, I needed to think of a way to kind of perform this inception where they felt like, oh, we're coming to these conclusions on our own. Like these make sense in our boardroom, the kind of language that we talk. And so we've all gone through direct to consumer. We've fully gone through that as a Web 2 sort of native business model. We have Shopify to enable that, and it's completely changed the supply chain of business. It's dematerialized quite a lot of it, maybe 40% of it. It created an entire wave of companies, and the way that business is done now is largely direct to consumer. And now in the kind of instance where we have a global pandemic, to not be able to get your product shipped to you because you can't go outside. So it felt like we were in that existence, and I wanted to kind of create something that drew a parallel back to that. Also showed that this isn't just marketing, right? This is a shift in the supply chain. This is a complete change in the way that we do business, in the way that we think about modeling new business. And so I came up with direct to avatar as a way to kind of shape that language. Did a Forbes article, and it kind of it hit a nerve with a lot of people. I've tried so many different things, so much different language, some of it way over people's heads, some of it way too complex. Jamie and the team at Outlier have been really very helpful in continuing to kind of ease down to simplify more and more. And then there are some terms that just sort of like they just hit. And it just sort of like caught its own traction, and direct to avatar was one of those. I'm also developing some other ones that I'm having the same experience with that are exciting. But direct to avatar just is I think a strong way to think about a Web3 enabled economy. And with self-sovereign identity, it can be decentralized, it could be open, but ultimately it's a shift in supply chain. So businesses and services and creators are actually selling directly, on a digital supply chain. They're selling directly to the end user, which is in the form of an avatar. And here we are sitting at a campfire from different parts in the world, and all having a conversation as an avatar.
Yeah, and Jamie, I guess that points to a couple of companies in your recent batch at Outlier. So companies like Ouroboros, who are doing a purely digital fashion brand. So this concept that, we have the Gucci's and the Versace's who are like, brands in the physical world. Like people like Ouroboros can be, high-end fashion brands of this kind of digital future. But also people like crypto avatars who, it was astonishing to see that, people are paying, hundreds, if not thousands of pounds to have their avatars created, which makes total sense as we spend more and more time of our time in these kind of spaces. Those digital items become very important to us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's really cool is we're starting to see some metaverse first brands being born. And these franchises will start in virtual sense, and then they will extend out into physical sense. So Ouroboros is a really good example. They do make physical couture, but they start from a point of digital. And so how they validate the need for a product or a fit with a particular design principle is in a virtual context. And so and they've got a really interesting stat, which is something like one in four luxury wearables, clothing, jewelry are now bought almost purely to be worn in social media and Instagram and things like that, which is like mind-blowing if you think about the carbon footprint of people buying physical things just to show off and flex in a virtual sense. And so, their starting point was, well, why don't we just make virtual items? It's couture because it can be custom fit to your dimensions with a bit of work, and then it's like a filter, an AR, not even AR, like a filter, virtual filter, and it could be an AR one as well. And they've done like Snapchat filters, and like hundreds of thousands of these Snapchat filters are now being used. So you're in Snapchat, and you can put on a dress or a piece of jewelry, and so that really excites me. And one of the key things about Metaverse native brands is just how consumer user-centric they are. Like community is that they are born of a community often, and then community is integral to the franchise. And so with those guys and other projects, we're helping them to effectively sell Genesis NFTs, which will be a wearable. But if you own that wearable, it's almost like a digital subscription. You then have the right to receive future drops, either in perpetuity or at a discount. And so there's going to be whole new models built around, by what virtual objects you have in your wallet will give all kinds of access to these virtual brands. And so that's why I think it's really interesting. You can start to think of NFTs as a new form of social media. It's a social context to how they're experienced. Crypto avatars, as you say, is another really good example. Because the avatar economy at the moment can't serve the demand, right? I mean, you could see the level of the lack of customization that we could do with the avatars that we're sat in here today, and that's just within this platform. But that's true of every platform. Very limited in terms of how much you can customize the avatar, the clothing and wearables you can wear, and ultimately, the ultimate form of expression in the metaverse is the avatar. Most people will have multiple avatars that will be context specific to a game or a social occasion. But the cost to build a custom avatar at the moment that is interoperable across platforms, which is what crypto avatars do, will cost you several $1,000s and will take a couple of weeks to develop if you can find the people to develop it. And of course, they're a very scarce group of people. So what crypto avatars are doing is people have made probably more custom avatars than anybody else on the planet, is that they are lowering the barrier to allowing anybody to have a unique avatar. And so they're actually leveraging things like NFTs and blockchains to allow for the formalization of remixing. So at the moment with VR chat, if I have an avatar, you can pretty much copy that. If you're in the same space as me, you can start wearing it. And so what people are doing, largely kids, they take it, they remix it somehow, they make it their own. But that is like a very informal economy. The original creator isn't being remunerated. And so they're looking at how you can have royalty systems, how you can take the base level, pay to remix it 2-3 times, and then you own the NFT that proves that that is your unique possession. You are the creator of it. And so again, I think all of these projects are doing is they're taking Web3 technology and they're applying it into the metaverse as it is today, which is just very restrictive and limited and impersonal.
Yeah. And it's funny because we've talked about avatars for a long time, but it was a really interesting point for me. A couple of weeks ago, somebody had taken a screenshot of me inside this platform and had posted it on Twitter in context to somebody else. And somebody in my network actually recognized me. There was no clue that it was me, but they were like, oh, that's Dave in that thing, just because, we've been in these spaces. And I think that's only going to continue, the fact that we're going to care about what we wear and how we look in these spaces. And we're probably going to look different in different spaces as well, right? As Ryan was mentioning earlier. I'm conscious of time. Petri, any last questions before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, maybe just to, as we are sitting here in Engage, we've been talking about NFTs a lot, DeFi, blockchain technologies. What do you see the role of AR and VR in the metaverse play specifically, or just a question to both?
I'll let you go first, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. And I apologize. I know I've been a while space here most of the interview. We'll have to schedule another one. But the AR and VR, I think, is spatial computing as a whole up. I think it's also been subject to quite a lot of hype cycles. And, you know, the thing about hype is it gets people really excited, but it takes away patience, you know? So if you're not getting what you're hyped up about immediately as instant gratification, you begin to write it off, you know? So there's a whole round of funding that was a little too early. Dave, you know this better than anyone else, that you've been investing in this space for a really long time and you've seen these cycles. And just because it hasn't made it yet, you know, I think it just means it's going to take a little time. We need to manage expectations. But all of this is really shaping up, I think, with Web3 to become overlay networks, right? That can screen in your hand or on your computer, or could very well be, you know, done through a spatial browser in glasses. And we see all of the sort of mapping that's being done in the real world to start to create these frameworks for all digital twins and things like that. So, you know, from a 3D perspective, none of this is any different, right? When you're in the engine and you're designing the 3D, the form factor in which it interfaces with the user is not as relevant, right? Your space is experienced either through a small screen, a medium screen, a big screen, glasses, you know. But the talent that is creating all of this stuff is really going to be creating it the way that they're doing it now. There's a great company named MXR that everybody should look at in terms of where the innovation for that stuff is going. But all the gaming and the environments that are built with game engines, they will be also just as relevant when it comes to VR and AR.
Yeah, and you know, I'd build on that and say that whilst there's lots of interesting innovation around open standards generally in software and VR and AR and you know how we experience all this stuff, I think at the same time for us there's a lot of missing fundamental innovations that allow for interoperability. That the minute that they're solved for, you know, Crucible being one of them, it just unblocks innovation, because interoperability is what's going to get value flowing across ecosystems. It's going to allow them to function more as a single metaverse rather than, you know, silos. And I think the powerful thing about Web3 and cryptocurrencies and NFTs are they are the economic incentive for open systems. You know, open source otherwise is generally kind of like a public good. You know, people contribute to it because they want to kind of benefit from it, but it's there's no real like hard economic incentive for everybody to kind of pile in. You know, here, because you can build those financial incentives, the same economic incentives that have allowed for, you know, Bitcoin to scale to handle billions of dollars of value globally, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for mining farms to have really looked to optimize, you know, how you can cool a whole shipping container, $1 million shipping container, to kind of solve for these games, to secure the network for Bitcoin. Like billions of dollars of hardware has been mobilized bottom up, no central coordination, because of these digital incentives. And so for me, what really excites me about Web3 is if we can imbue AR, VR, virtual worlds with these same economic incentives, we can allow for this kind of bootstrapping of bottom-up growth from the economy. And so, you know, I'm already speaking, you talk about the distinction perhaps between AR and VR. We're already speaking with a number of metaverse brands, let's say, who are from day one, you know, kind of a transmedia company, right? They've got a concept, they've got a character, and you know, they're designing that character in a gaming engine, and they're saying, well, actually, I could reuse that 3D model as an avatar, and I can sell those avatars as NFTs. The kind of virtual space that I'm designing around that character could be a virtual world that people could experience. You're then 1-2 steps away from building a game. And so we're speaking to one franchise. They've already been offered an option for a movie by a major animation studio. But the movie is just one part of the franchise. You know, they're thinking about crowdfunding part of the money through pre-sale of NFTs. Those NFTs will be some of the characters that are going to be in the movie. They're already building, you know, as they're creating the characters for the movie, they're building gaming environments that will be rolled out in between the release of the movies. And so one of the big missing pieces in the metaverse, and especially the open metaverse, is content. There's just not enough good content, even for me, to keep going back into the quest. Like maybe once a week. I'd love to be doing it more, but there's just not enough content there for me to jump into. So again, I think as we allow for this bottom-up innovation, for people to be able to build on one another's innovations, we're going to see more content in these virtual worlds, more reason for people to come into them, and then greater interoperability, allowing for the kind of the acceleration of the metaverse as a whole.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation, guys. I've certainly learned a lot. I think the big takeaway for me is, you know, there is this great potential of Web3, right? It's going to take maybe 10 years to realize, but, you know, now is a good time because we've got the plumbing. You know, we've had, you know, several years of people putting some of the infrastructure in. We've got companies like Crucible who are kind of democratizing the access to some of those tools to developers and to games developers. And now we have accelerators like Outlier who can actually fund some of these projects and bring them to maturity. So it does seem like, you know, over the next 10 years, you know, things are going to start to look very different, and we're going to see a huge amount of innovation, and, you know, there's also some big winners out of that. So yeah, really exciting time. Maybe we could just end up with you guys. Oh, go ahead, Ryan. Yeah, final thought.
Weigh in on some final thoughts. So I part of the heuristic in why I kind of create and shape language, it's not just to coin terms. It's because I think we have a huge language barrier that is a real issue. And there's a lot of different cliques, and certainly Web3 is a small community compared to mainstream. But, you know, being that this is, I think, a great platform to have this conversation, we definitely should shape language for how to talk to consumers, but I think we also really need to shape language for how to talk to executives. You know, so when you know, coming up with that direct and these types of words, it's something that executives really understand. And you know, my life now is just constantly having meetings, conversations with executives, because these integrations is how this is going to happen. You know, independent developers, players absolutely drive this, but we're at a stage right now where we're in a paradigm shift. And so, you know, I missed where you asked for the definition of metaverse, but something I've sort of formed in the way I've talked about it recently is, look at the internet up until this point. It's been shaped and architected by web developers and mobile app developers, right? You could say web was sort of took its hold with web pages in Web 1, and then we got mobile phones with apps, and then it was mobile app developers. If you're an executive, just think of the metaverse as the internet shaped and architected by game developers. You know, that's a really strong sort of thing that's taking place right now. Now, the Web3 decentralization is a much more important sustainable economic model for that, but that's the best way to think of the metaverse. And that's why we talk about game engines, and we talk about game developers, and we talk about gaming, and never have to over-explain this to any of the younger generation. You know, so if you're an executive and you know you see your kids playing Roblox or Fortnite, like, go beyond just watching that or you know, giving them some money to buy those currencies. Like, really try to talk to them about it, because the people that understand Crucible the quickest are like all in high school, and they're native to this world, and they're native to these ideas, and whatever we build now will be handed off to them. You know, I spent a lot of time with Jamie during the lockdown, and you know, her daughter is a good example, right? She's on the younger side of the age group with that, but you know, she's growing up in this world where, like, going to these games and hanging out with friends in these places is just as real as you and I go into the pub. You know, and these kids in high school, they they really believe that, So I think as we sort of all become a part of this trend, the reason I've created up this association in Switzerland called Open Meta is because like Crucible is a business and it's a company, and we're creating a product and we're gonna sort of like take it to the market. But this thing is so much bigger than just our company. That's why I'm so glad to see Jamie, shaping it up the way he is and supporting it, because it's a rising tide that everybody's a part of. This is a moment in time. It's a singular moment in a lifetime. These opportunities come more than a couple times in a lifetime. And the language barrier that I keep coming up against is something that I hope we can talk about more. I hope that on platforms like this, we can start to not only just talk about how do we appease to the consumer, but I think we have the obligation to learn how to tell this story to executives as well, and get them from the point that they think about within that boardroom. Because like I said, everyone sort of knows this is the future, but everyone is shaping up their strategy for it now. And I think it's important people like you to have a platform to kind of be part of translating that.
Well, thanks. That's a great comment to end on. Quick plugs before we head out. Jamie, where can startups apply? When do you have your next program? And you have a podcast too. Where can people find it?
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. So people can apply. We're perpetually recruiting for startups. So we pretty much run cohorts back to back. We've actually just announced that we are going to be running a significant part of Filecoin's, the global accelerator, and we've got several other protocols as well alongside ours. So if you go to outlierventures.io/basecamp, we use the kind of mountaineering analogy. You can apply there, and that will either be for our kind of technology agnostic accelerator and or any one of the protocol accelerators that we're working with. As I said, we'll accelerate 100 startups this year. So if you're looking at the metaverse, you don't have to be a crypto native. You don't have to be a Web3 native. You can be curious about how these principles can apply. What I would say is that, if you're building a company for the next decade, to do that as a Web2 startup is kind of stillborn. You're kind of dead before you've even started. You'll probably still raise money because there's a lot of VCs that are still thinking in Web2 terms, but you're not going to go very far very fast. So that's Basecamp. If you're a later stage project and you're literally on the cusp of launching a token network, but you want help to make sure that goes out and realizes its full potential, we have outlierventures.io/ascent, so you're climbing the top of the mountain. And yes, I have a podcast called The Founders of Web3 on iTunes and every other platform, where I talk to the leading founders like Ryan and across the wider ecosystem, not just our portfolio, about the innovations and space that they're going in.
Yeah, it's great to see you recording some podcasts in spaces like this as well. So, we'll get through the technical glitches, and hopefully we'll see more podcasts being recorded in spaces like this. Ryan, you're also hanging out on Clubhouse a lot. Tell us more about that, and where can people sign up to find out about Crucible and your mission to build the open metaverse?
Yeah, so Clubhouse was a rally for me in the middle of lockdown. I brought a lot of this discussion of NFTs and the metaverse to the app, made my case to the founding team why I thought that could be the place that people go to get that. And it actually blew away my expectations. I think what we witnessed with the art-focused NFTs was pretty influenced by the Clubhouse behavior and activity. We would have rooms with Blau and with people during the live drop. I'd keep the stages open and people could come in, press could come in, and people who were just kind of passing by that knew nothing about it, I would leave stages open for hours. It was a huge effort, and it took a lot of energy, and we created a group there, a club called the Open Metaverse. So you can find that. But also all on Telegram. So if you go to t.me/open-metaverse, that's our Crucible chat. We just passed 1,200 people. I like to think of it as our beat of the open metaverse. It really is sort of very high quality group of people. And then we're Crucible.network. I'm Ryan at Crucible Network. And yeah, we're at a place where we just kind of closed a round and we have the resources we need to execute on this vision. And so we're not going to continue to kind of like feed into the hype at this point. It's time for us to build and kind of put our heads down, and all the activity that we really, when we interact with the community, or if you'd like to become a part of the community, Telegram is definitely the place to go right now.
Yeah, exciting. Cool. Well, thanks so much for your time, guys. Really appreciate it. Maybe Petri, where can we find you on Twitter and on the web?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is Rajahalme. Happy to talk to everybody. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. Yeah, I can definitely vouch for the Telegram group of the Open Metaverse. It's very, very valuable if you want to get to know what's happening on the spot.
Yeah, definitely. And you can find me, I'm at Haynes_Dave on Twitter. You can also find the Viewpoints podcast. If you Google Medium and Viewpoints, we need to get a dedicated website set up, but we've got previous episodes with Sketchfab, with Rec Room, and with several others. So yeah, do come back. But thanks for watching. Thanks to the guests, and we'll see you all again next time. Thank you.
Thanks for having us on. Thanks for all your good work in the space as well, Dave.
If we're doing Twitter, I'm at Ryan Crucible.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.